Hello, everyone. This is Rachida Somai. I'm very pleased to have you here today. And with Alesh, we are looking forward to this webinar where we are going to focus on the impact of the chemical strategy for sustainability on the future shaping up of the food contact legislation that you all know is under revision. So what I will do is basically give you, I will give you an overview of the food contact legislation, where it stands today, and explain the reasons for the revision of this legislation. And that then Alesh would take over and really discuss the main actions that the Commission has proposed within in the context of the chemical strategy that would have a potential impact on food contact. So to start this, this presentation, we wanted to give you just an overview of the food contact legislation in context. And obviously you have upstream in the supply chain, you have the chemical industry and the chemical legislation that need to comply with. And in that area, the Commission is working closely with the European Chemical Agency in the regulation of substances and mixtures that are being used. When biocides are also added to these substances or mixtures, the biocidal product regulation also kicks in. This legislation needs to be taken into consideration when those chemicals are being used in food contact. One point that is important to mention during this presentation is the fact that ECHA, when looking at substances, ECHA looks at certain endpoints like occupational safety, environmental safety, but they do not look at dietary exposure. So when substances and chemicals are being used in food contacts, that's where the dietary exposure is becomes relevant in that context, and this is really assessed by in the context of evaluation of food contact substances by EFSA. EFSA is also responsible for the food itself. So EFSA has really a large scope in terms of competence over dietary exposure, basically. So this really places things into context, and you will see that in the food contact legislation, when you read the food contact legislation, except for the reference to the functional barrier where CMR are substances that are classified as CMR are really excluded from the benefit of the functional barrier. That would be probably the only instance where we see a cross-reference to the chemical legislation. So this being said, the food contact legislation and why it is really being revised. So I'm not going to go through these slides in its entirety, but suffice to say that what is in yellow in your screen is really the EU food contact legislation, where you have really the overarching legislation, the framework regulation, and the legislation that has been adopted by the European Commission on the basis of that framework regulation. And when you see this number of harmonized measures adopted by the Commission, you will see that there are not so many with respect to food contact materials, especially if you compare these harmonized measures for the materials like plastic, recycled plastics, regenerated cellulose, active and intelligent packaging, ceramic. You will see that there are not many harmonized measures compared to the bottom of the screen, where you see the materials that are not subject to harmonization, except, of course, for the horizontal measures in the framework regulation and GMP regulation that also apply to those, but you don't have any compositional requirements. And because national legislation governs mainly the market for those materials that are not subject to harmonization, you have the mutual recognition, which is also an EU principle that is supposed to resolve the issues stemming from the lack of harmonization. However, in practice, we understand that the mutual recognition principle is considered both by operators and also by member states to not really be a tool that is easy to be used and efficient in practice. And this led the Commission, along with other observations from NGOs, the European Parliament, to reevaluate this legislative framework. The Parliament notably mentioned in a resolution that dates back 2016, where the Parliament highlighted the weaknesses of the food contact legislation, following up in that regard on the Joint Research the Joint Research Center, the GRC, baseline study that had outlined also the difficulties in the non-harmonized sectors, where the risk assessment by member states was done differently from one member state to another, where the same substance was listed and permitted for use in one member state and not for in another, and so forth. So they have highlighted those points. As I earlier said, also industry was also has been pushing hard on more harmonization for the sectors that are not currently harmonized because of the difficulties in entering and marketing in the EU. And also enforcement authorities, national authorities have considered that there was a need to support them in the evaluation of the safety requirements, which was not easy in the absence of measures. So this led the Commission to engage in this reevaluation of the food contact legislation. So it's important also to keep in mind that this reevaluation of the food contact legislation is taking place in a changing legislative environment, where we have had the plastic strategy in 2018, where the Commission has established important goals with respect to plastics, where it indicated that all plastics should be recyclable. All plastic packaging should be recyclable and or reusable by 2030, and that means that the safety of such packaging that would be recyclable would need still to be ensured. The farm to fork strategy also indicated the Commission indicated there that it was committing to revise the food contact legislation to strengthen food safety and public health. And in this same vein, we have also the chemical strategy for sustainability that was published in October of last year, where clearly there were clear reference to the need to kind of streamline the chemical legislation and also address chemicals in certain consumer products. And this is basically really the core of the discussion of this webinar today. And this is really going to be really covered by Aleš later on. So based on all these elements, the Commission had commissioned a third party called Ecoris to look at the existing food contact legislation and really prepare a report outlining what was working, what was not working. Basically, the outcome was to determine whether the food contact legislation was still fit for purpose, meaning that whether to show whether or assess whether the legislation was still sufficiently enabling food safety and the human health protection to be ensured, and also verifying whether the free movement of goods and the internal market was supported by the existing legislation. So on the basis of this ECORIS report, the Commission published later on in December of last year a roadmap. And in this roadmap, the Commission has identified 8 key problems in the sector of food contact. So I am not going to go through all these 8 problems. They are all important, but for the purpose of this webinar, I'm going to focus on the first point that is relevant with respect to the chemical strategy. The Commission identified the fact that there is the prioritization of the most hazardous substances was lacking in the food contact legislation, and the fact that there is no mechanism to update based on new data the safety assessment that has been done on substances. I must recall that the framework regulation, Article 11.5, provides the obligation for operators to notify the Commission of new data that would affect the safety assessment that has been done by EFSA. So if an operator is aware of such new data, and when such new data is such significant to have an impact on the safety assessment, such data should be notified. But in practice, it's true that it says such a notification has been done only very rarely. I'm aware of a few instances because certain clients came to us and asked us whether they were subject to obligations. But when you look at the number of new studies that may be available, this was not really an obligation that was really in practice implemented, and maybe there were no justification for such an implementation, although in certain cases that may be doubtful. So second point, the Commission was saying that in its roadmap that the existing rules in the food contact legislation was not supporting and promoting the development of safer and more sustainable alternatives. And it's true that you don't find in the food contact legislation a clear reference to bio-based product, for instance. It's true that there is a common thinking that bio-based products, because of their link to nature, are less of concern for human safety, but that needs to be verified. It's not always the case. So the Commission wants to promote the development of safer alternatives by establishing rules that would address such type of products. So in terms of the future changes that have been mentioned in this roadmap, the Commission was thinking of shifting, from the evaluation of substances to including the final material. Final materials, they want to look at all potential migrants from final materials into food. Excuse me. And also, they want to prioritize the assessment of substances, and they have proposed a tiered approach that is composed of tier 1 substances, which would encompass substances that are considered of safety concern, as other substances like CMRs, endocrine disruptors, excuse me, persistent bioaccumulative toxic substances, and so forth. Obviously, in this roadmap, the Commission has not really elaborated on what exactly, which CMR, all CMRs, certain categories of CMRs would qualify for this group. A second group would be the substances that raise certain specific concerns, like substances in nanoform. And for these two groups, tier 1 and tier 2 substances, the Commission does not really explain how these would be assessed, but presumably they would be assessed in collaboration between ECHA and EFSA, given that in the chemical strategy, the Commission was highlighting that the different authorities assisting the Commission were not really coordinating their work and collaborating enough. And then there would be a tier 3 approach where substances of less concerns, and that would be probably by default those that are not really filling in tier 1 and tier 2 approach would fall into tier 3 substances, and that would be subject to a safety determination by business operators. We have also as other changes that are not really linked to the chemical strategy, so I'm not going to elaborate on those, but that these are important, especially the possibility for the Commission, because they are considering putting in place notified bodies for the compliance assessment. They have not really elaborated enough on this, but I see that the establishment of such notified body that would take in charge the compliance assessment could really lead to certain questions with respect, for instance, of liability for the assessment done. Would they be liable for that compliance work versus the company who has asked them to do that compliance work, how they are going to do that work, would they be qualified to do that work, and so forth. So in terms of future steps, the Commission is going to really, in principle, and develop an impact assessment, in which the Commission should detail the options retained or considered, and this impact assessment would be open to consultation, 12-week consultation. We thought that the Commission would issue this impact assessment during this second quarter of this year. So we are still in the second quarter. So this is not really the Commission in this respect might be on time based on the announcement that the Commission indicated. But we'll see if this document is released during this quarter. It's important to keep in mind that there would be also targeted consultation activities following that impact assessment, the publication of that impact assessment, and that could give you good opportunities, obviously, to comment on the different options that the Commission will consider. Very optimistically, I think the Commission is thinking that by the fourth quarter of next year, the Commission would be ready with a proposal for a revision of the EU legislation. And the way they put that, it seems to me that they have already made up their mind as to what they are going to do in that. It seems to me that they are going to significantly revise this framework, especially given the initiatives they intend to take within the context of the chemical strategy, which, as Aleš is going to explain, might change really dramatically the future of the food contact legislation. And on this, I think I will let you, Aleš, take over.
Thank you, Rashida. So my part of the presentation will focus on the chemical strategy for sustainability. Probably we will exceed our presentation time that was scheduled for 4:45. But we will still try to keep 15 minutes for questions and answers. So we probably will finish after 5. I hope that it will be fine. So the CSS was, as Rashida mentioned, published in October 2020. It's a communication from the European Commission. So it's really a high-level political document. It's not a legislative proposal, or it's not in any way binding. But it's a good indication of key actions that will be taken by the European Commission in the very near future. Of course, the Commission, because chemicals registration typically is adopted by the European Parliament and by the Council, so the Commission can only prepare proposals that later will be submitted for the ordinary legislative procedure with the European Parliament and the Council. So these are basically the actions for the Commission to be taken by preparing proposals. Next slide, please. So let's maybe just put CSS into the context. Can we have next slide, please? Yes, voilà. So it's the chemical strategy for sustainability is part of the European Green Deal program that was presented in December 2019 by the new commissioner, and the goals are zero pollution and toxic-free environment. And for the CSS, it's mainly the toxic-free environment element that is relevant. The Commission is really serious in pushing this forward, and as we will see later, they have very ambitious proposals how to achieve toxic-free environment in the EU. The Commission is also hiring some 50 officials currently that will work only on chemicals in the near future. So I think we have to really expect in next 1 or 2 years a complete change of landscape in current approaches to chemicals regulations. And of course, it will also impact food contact legislation. It's not only about REACH and CLP, it's also about, of course, food contact legislation. Next slide, please. Let's just go quickly through the main elements that I will elaborate later. So first one, phase out of the most harmful chemicals for non-essential uses and grouping of chemicals for this purpose. Second element that is related to the first one, define the criteria for essential uses. The third one is establishment of one substance, one assessment element, which really relates to the relationship between ECHA and EFSA, as already suggested by Rashida. The fourth one is generic approach for risk management for most harmful chemicals, which again relates to restriction of harmful chemicals in products, but allows for let's say a fast tracking of some most harmful classes of chemicals, registration of polymers, establishment of legally binding criteria for the identification of endocrine disruptors, and provisions to take account of combination effects of chemicals in products. And also there are some changes in CLP envisaged, such as new hazard classes and changes in classification and labeling. So let's now focus on specific elements more in detail. Next slide, please. So first, let's start with road plan for REACH revision, because most of these changes will be implemented via REACH, but not only, of course. Interestingly, REACH actually has never been amended since its adoption, except for its annexes, of course. But the core text of REACH has never been amended. So this is really first big revision of REACH that is going to happen. What is the timing? The first step was a publication of inception impact assessment. That means preliminary impact assessment in May 4, 2021. That is currently still open for feedback, for stakeholder consultation. So anyone can actually comment. It's open until June 1. You will find a link to participate on the web page of the European Commission on the CSS. This will be followed by full impact assessment that will start in autumn 2021, probably. And by the end of 2022, there will be a big public consultation of 12 weeks. And by then, the impact assessment document that will be published, or the preliminary impact assessment document, will already provide more information on what is in the pipeline. The draft proposal for revision of REACH 2022, again, the Commission proposal, that will then go to the Parliament and to the Council. So it will prolong the whole period for several years, probably. And adoption of proposal end 2022. These timelines are, in my view, quite ambitious, and I think in the end it will be longer than this. Next slide, please. Okay, so first big element, a restriction of substances for non-essential uses. So substances of concern, and not only of very high concern, and we are not talking about SVHC here. We are talking about substances of any concern to be later defined, should be restricted for non-essential societal uses. And of course, normally the substances should be identified specifically. So it cannot be, the Commission cannot adopt vague criteria that any substance of concern, it has to be really identified specifically. Of course, since there is derogation for non-essential, for essential societal uses, there must be also coupled with criteria for granting derogations that also are under development currently. This will be mainly implemented via REACH restrictions, because REACH has a tool for restriction of substances. But it will not only be addressed in REACH, it may be addressed in other legislation, including food contact material legislation. It can be really even inclusion of some blacklists, or extension of blacklists where there are already blacklists in specific legislation. So it goes beyond REACH, this concept. So this concept of restricting substances of concern for non-essential societal uses will be coupled with group assessment of chemicals with similar hazard, risk, or function. And this is very important because, of course, it would be difficult to address specifically every substance of concern individually. So the Commission is intending really to strengthen the use of grouping of substances to tackle substitution by similar substances of concern, for example, and then to subject the entire groups to restriction, which may include several hundreds or even thousands of substances in one group, in one procedure. And first battlefield actually of this concept is the upcoming restriction proposal for PFAS that relates to the entire group of PFAS. That means, again, hundreds or even thousands of substances. And we will be talking about the PFAS restriction proposal later. But not only PFAS, but also bisphenols and phthalates are mentioned specifically for grouping. So these are the priority groups that may be subject as such to future restriction for non-essential societal uses. Next slide, please. Of course, definition of essential uses will be the core, and they are currently under discussion at the Commission level, at the Caracal level. And Caracal is let's say, a working group for REACH represented by where representative of member states are present. In March, Caracal issued a summary of responses to comments. It's basically a summary of comments received previously on the concept of essential uses. And by reading between the line of this document, it is clear that the concept goes beyond REACH. Food contact materials not mentioned specifically, but it's clear that it will also be reflected in food contact material legislation. And the concept of essentiality in the Montreal Protocol should be used as a starting point to initiate discussions. So what the Montreal Protocol, that is actually on environmental endpoint, says. So Montreal Protocol says that the essentiality is broken down into 4 elements. First is criticality. That means, is the use critical for society? And public health and environmental elements are the key elements, but not only. It's really, is the use critical for society? Then, of course, availability of alternatives. that is already used in the current restriction procedures. The criteria also take into account whether emissions are already minimized. If it's still possible to minimize emissions, then no one can really say that the use is already that the use should be exempted. And the fourth element is availability of the controlled substance from existing stock or by recycling, but this according to the document is not relevant to REACH. So really the criticality will be the main element for consideration, as also stressed in the document. The document includes significant input from Client Earth. That is an NGO, quite prominent NGO, and Client Earth identified the following elements as being non-essential for society. That is luxury, convenience, leisure, cosmetics, toys, or decorative products. So luxury products, cosmetic products, toys should be free of substances of concern, basically. No one can claim that that substance is essential. Substance of concern is essential in a toy, for example. Next slide, please. The Client Earth also proposed some criteria for granting derogations. That means supporting that the use is essential for society. So is the use relevant for safety or health? This is rather clear. Are material, energy, performance, efficiency affected? This is quite interesting, I think, for food contact materials, and it's actually coupled with the fourth bullet point. Whether or not the use significantly extends the lifetime of a product, improves durability, less consumption of raw materials, less consumption of energy. So this means that environmental elements should also be taken into account. And if a substance of concern leads to better recyclability of product or to its lower environmental footprint, then this should be a relevant element for consideration. And I think this is quite important for food contact materials. Next slide, please. So summary relevant to food contact materials with respect to the essentiality use, essentiality element. So there is clearly change of current approach, because currently food contact materials are only assessed as for their safety and not essentiality. The use is not relevant for EFSA. This is going to change. Risk is not going to be relevant, maybe not at all. The only question is whether substance of concern is essential. Risk assessment by EFSA will likely continue only for substances not identified for a ban or derogated from a ban. So EFSA, assumingly, will only be assessing substances that are of lower hazard. And in our view, food contact material is a sector for which derogations will likely be available based on essentiality, of course, if justified. Because of course, food packaging, food contact materials are critical for society in a way. So if their usability is affected by ban, then it should be pointed out, and as well as environmental benefits, better biodegradability, compostability. All these arguments should be used to fight for a derogation for specific substances in food contact materials. So really, advocacy activities are essential for food contact materials. During ongoing public consultations on general concepts, and also when there are actually specific proposals for specific ban. We also ask ourselves a question whether EFSA could have a role actually in establishing these general criteria for food contact for substances used in food contact material. If in the end of the day, risk assessment factor should also be part of the assessment of essential uses, because currently a risk, the fact that the hazard is sufficiently controlled normally should not be relevant at all for the ban of substances of concern. But I think in the end of the day, the Commission or the other EU institutions will introduce some kind of risk assessment factor in the assessment, and there may be a role for EFSA. And of course, grouping is very relevant to food contact materials, because it's possible that there will be a proposal to ban all phthalates and all bisphenols from food contact materials. Next slide, please. PFAS, it's one of the priorities of the chemical strategy for sustainability, also on a global scale. So it's likely that the Commission will promote ban of PFAS at the global scale, as had happened in the past, for example, for PFOA and PFOS. So some PFAS are already in the REACH restriction process, and actually quite late in the restriction process. Denmark already restricted all PFAS in food packaging. And the Netherlands, based on our information from the authorities, is working on a similar ban. So the EU is now going to prepare a proposal to ban all PFAS. Next slide, please. So what will be the content of the restriction? Well, PFAS to be restricted on their own in mixtures and in articles, including food contact materials, above a specific threshold. This will be crucial, of course, the threshold. It will be, in our view, somewhere between 1 milligram per kilogram, which is currently limit for PFOA related substances, and 0.1 weight by weight, which is usually the upper limit in most of the restrictions. So it will be somewhere in between. Of course, PFAS to be banned for all non-essential uses. So as I said, this is the first actually battlefield of this concept. And of course, the question is to what extent PFAS are essential in food contact materials, bearing in mind that they are mainly used in disposable food contact materials that are not in principle essential. Under this link, you can find quite interesting ECHA presentation on the restriction of PFAS in the pipeline. And it also, for example, it provides what should be the definition of PFAS subject to the restriction. So substances that contain at least one aliphatic CF2 or CF3 element, including precursors. Next slide, please. Let's now look at the timing of the PFAS restriction. So announcement of restriction intention to ECHA is expected during first half of 2021. So it would just be intention to restrict. It will not be the restriction proposal as such. That is expected first half 2022. And the final restriction should be adopted by the European Commission in 2025. It's really a long process, and there will be several public consultation. The first one will be launched after the publication of the proposal, and it will last 6 months. And the second one will be published after there is draft ECHA committee report. It will last 2 months. So there will be plenty of possibilities to raise your voice and to ask for exemptions, derogations, sell-off periods. Under the link on this slide, you see the registry of restriction intentions that is regularly updated. So you will be able to see what restrictions are in the pipeline, which of course relates not only to PFAS but to any other restrictions. Next slide, please. Okay, one substance, one evaluation principle. I think this principle is very relevant to food packaging, because currently many substances used in food contact materials are subject to 2 assessments. First, substance is assessed by REACH or evaluated by REACH for its uses from the hazard perspective. and then it's subject to risk assessment by EFSA. And often these two regimes do not really communicate well, or do not really correspond. For example, REACH ban of the 4 phthalates of the greatest concern is not specifically applicable to food contact materials. So they are in principle still subject to EFSA risk assessment. In other words, EFSA can still say that phthalates that are banned by REACH can still be used in food contact materials if their risk is controlled. And of course, this it will probably end because the strategy envisages 1 evaluation per 1 substance. And in reading between the lines of the documents available, it would appear that the packed list could be one of the bases for the evaluation based on REACH. That means for the only evaluation that a substance may actually undergo. And packed list is largely hazard oriented. So packed list is mainly used to identify hazards to be maybe later assessed at the risk level. So of course there is a concern that substances would be banned at the REACH level already based on their hazard profile. And they actually, EFSA would not get even an opportunity to assess whether it would be safe in food contact materials. Again, our question mark, to what extent actually EFSA can play a role in assessing the essentiality element, whether a risk will at all be taken into consideration later in this concept. An example of phthalates can be used as example where actually the legislator acknowledged that food contact materials should be managed under different regime than REACH restriction. So I think there's still some room to advocate a different regime for food contact materials. Next slide, please. So extension of generic approach to risk management. This is another element specifically mentioned in the strategy. So what is it? It's fast tracking of restriction measures, basically. For example, Article 68.2 allows the Commission to directly restrict CMRs for in consumer products. Or plastic packaging requirements. Also, there is a ban of CMRs, for example. So this is really a possibility for the Commission to fast track and to ban entire group of substances based on their hazard. So this is going to extend, or the strategy wants to extend it to endocrine disruptors, PBT and VPVB substances at the first place. So these would be considered under the same bucket as CMRs and could be directly banned. And even based on self-assessment, if everyone would actually have to assess if their product could be considered as endocrine disruptor or PBT, and would then have to phase it out. And at the second stage, potentially based on further impact assessment, the Commission wants to extend this concept to immunotoxicants, neurotoxicants, respiratory sensitizers, and STOTs, and extend it to professional uses. So not only these specific substances of concern would be restricted from consumer uses, but also from professional uses, which is a really significant extension. But to our surprise, in this concept, the CSS also mentions that derogation of essential uses could still be possible here. So actually, in our view, the extension of generic approach to risk management is not that different from the concept that I mentioned on the first slide earlier in my presentation, where substances of concern would be banned for essential uses. I think the only difference is how fast tracked or how easy will be to get restriction, because whether it can be really adopted just by the Commission, or whether it has to go all procedure based on either REACH restriction or specific legislation. Next slide, please. Another element, it's how to tackle combination effects of chemicals in product. So the strategy wants to introduce a mixture assessment factor into Annex 1 of REACH. That is Annex on safety assessment of substances. So they want to have a default factor that would always be applied to any substance under safety assessment, to take into account the fact that it will likely be used in the future in mixtures. So it will automatically make the substance more hazardous, basically. And the risk management measures may have to be adjusted in the chemical safety assessment, and maybe even some uses phased out, or some uses adjusted. So this should apply to all substances, but with respect to food contact materials, we have to take into consideration that there is already additional allocation factor that is used by EFSA in the latest evaluations of food contact substances, to take into consideration of the same issue, basically, of the cocktail effect. So I think the industry should make sure that there is no double application of this factor in the future for food contact materials. And next slide, please. Another element, REACH registration of polymers. Of course, this is not new. This has not been introduced by the strategy. It has been already debated for years. So as you know, polymers are exempted from REACH restriction, provided that their monomers and other chemically bound substances have been registered. So what the strategy now mentions specifically is that polymers should be subject to REACH registration except for polymers of low concern. So the key point, of course, that is still under discussion is how to define polymers of low concern. Currently, it's the Commission has been proposing several criteria based on classification, their molecular weight, etc., which would mean, by estimates, that there would be some 11,000 unique polymers subject to registration after all the grouping and all further adjustments. So 11,000. So I think this would really cause a workability issue for industry and for the European Chemicals Agency. So recently, the European Commission suggested incorporating Canadian criteria for identification of polymers of low concern into the system. This would probably mean that the criteria would be more workable and clearer. So I think we still have to see whether the Commission will really just substitute the current approach by the Canadian approach. I think this will be clear in the months to come. Next slide, please. Let's quickly talk about CLP revision. Actually, also there was an inception impact assessment published on the same day as REACH inception impact assessment, and there is also feedback until June 1st. But the timing of CLP revision is more tight than REACH. There will also be a full impact assessment, but the draft CLP amendment is already adopted, is expected 2022 and adoption 2023. Next slide, please. Endocrine disruptors. This is really one of the core elements of the strategy. So the strategy proposes to establish hazard identification of endocrine disruptors. This would be based on WHO definition and building on criteria already developed for pesticides and biocides. But the current EU criteria for identification of endocrine disruptors is not really workable at the moment, and especially the criteria identification in pesticides and biocides legislation have been criticized. And as a result, only very few actually substances have been currently identified as endocrine disruptors. So the Commission probably will come up with more strict and straightforward criteria to identify EDs. The proposed classification, possible classification, is known, presumed, suspected, and very importantly, after classification, and of course, importantly, endocrine disruptor would be a new hazard class. Basically, the substances would have to be classified and labeled as endocrine disruptors. Currently, this is not a hazard class. This is just criterion in other legislation than REACH and CLP. So after classification, basically self-classification, because everyone will have to apply these new criteria in the future. So after self-classification, there will be an automatic ban of endocrine disruptors in consumer products for non-essential uses. This is specifically mentioned in the strategy, including, of course, in food contact materials. There will be no way for endocrine disruptors to be used in food contact materials, basically, once identified. Which means, of course, that endocrine disruptors will likely be affected by the one substance, one evaluation principle, because EFSA will not get to evaluate endocrine disruptors anymore, because they will be just banned on the basis of REACH. Importantly, recently in April 2021, the French authority ANSES issued a document identifying 16 priority endocrine disruptors, and I think these are really the substances that will be used also by the European Commission, maybe to identify priority substances and maybe even to set the criteria. These 16 priority endocrine disruptors are major industrial chemicals. So check this list. Next slide, please. There are also other new hazard classes: PBT, persistent bioaccumulative toxic, and very persistent variable bioaccumulative, that are currently addressed by REACH. That means that it's actually the PBT VPVB assessment is necessary based on REACH, but it is not a hazard class as yet. So again, PBT in the future will be classified and labeled as such. Future classification will be based on Annex 13 REACH criteria, so nothing is expected to change as to how to identify PBT and VPVB, but there are going to be new classes likely that will be in the same bucket as PBT and VPVB, and these are persistent mobile and toxic. That means not bioaccumulative, but mobile. And this concept has already been used as a category of SVHCs, but it's going likely to be new hazard class for environmental toxicity. And the criteria and guidance how to identify PMT have already been established by German Environmental Agency. And so I think it's a good indication how the PMTs will be identified. One of the core elements is that actually they since they are mobile, they can be found in remote areas such as in Antarctica. And of course, PMT will likely follow the same path as PBT, a restriction for non-essential uses. Next slide, please. This is just really very fast changes to harmonized classification and labeling. This is so that there will be possibility for Commission to request ECHA to develop new harmonized classification and labeling dossier. Currently, Commission does not have this power. Also introducing a prioritization mechanism for harmonizing the classification of certain chemicals. Now, only CMRs and biocides and pesticides are prioritized for harmonized classification labeling. But we think that substances in food contact materials are actually good candidates to be prioritized for harmonized classification labeling. And there will also be additional opportunity for interested parties to comment in the harmonized classification labeling. For example, possibility to repeat public consultation and introduce possibility for companies to initiate a change of harmonized classification labeling, because currently there is no such possibility. So I would encourage everybody to stress these elements, to have better saying in the procedure in your future advocacy elements. Next slide, please. So just few final thoughts. Of course, there is internal pushback within the Commission services, because the strategy is driven by DG Environment, and it has been criticized by DG Grow. You will see the bullet points that the DG Grow raised in the past. It's quite old, actually. I think it's from last year, this information. Since then, I think maybe the DG Grow is more careful in criticizing publicly the initiative, but you bear in mind that DG Grow is the counterbalancing, let's say, efforts of DG Environment. Next slide, please. Of course, there will also be opportunities for industry, because one of the goals of the strategy is to develop safer alternatives and sustainable by design substances. So there will be business opportunities in developing safer alternatives, and also to get some funds from European programs. So there are business opportunities in developing safer alternatives. Also bearing in mind that the elements of the strategy will likely be implemented in the more distant future worldwide. So if you are in advance, then it will give you opportunity in the future. Next slide, please. So it's not going to be easy task for EU authorities, because many of these concepts are questionable from the EU legal principles perspective. So we expect that the industry will challenge all these initiatives in the court during public consultations, whatnot. So this will be a long process. There will be numerous opportunities to participate in public consultation, and you should really let your voice be heard. There will be opportunities, and the Commission needs your input to provide targeted and tailored rules. Thank you very much for your attention. So as anticipated, we exceeded the time, but I think we can still afford 10-15 minutes for questions.
So in terms of the questions that we received thus far, there was one question from an attendee asking about CMR substances used, the question of CMR substances behind a functional barrier. And it's true, I was mentioning in the beginning of the presentation, I was mentioning that the reference to the chemical legislation was basically mainly done in the context of the functional barrier. And the functional barrier is a concept that basically is being used if you want to use a substance that is subject to listing in the plastics regulation and that is not listed there. So you can use a functional barrier, but you need to meet certain conditions. And one of the conditions is that the substance should not be CMR, should not be nanoform. It should not exceed 10 ppb, 10 ppb if it were to migrate, 10 ppb being the detection limit. So yes, you correctly understood that substances that are CMR and that are subject to listing in the plastics regulation cannot avail of the functional barrier, along with substances that are in nanoform. There is another question also regarding the plastics regulation. So the plastics regulation excludes colorants and refers to national legislation for using colorants, and that's definitely correct. However, the question is what is or what is not a colorant is not specified in the plastics regulation. And the person asking, what is our opinion? It's true that the plastics regulation does not contain a definition of what a colorant, and in fact, for that matter, it does not contain a lot of other relevant definitions of terms that are not included there. But you may look at the guidance document that the Commission published on the plastics regulation, where it may contain a definition of colorant there. I haven't checked that, so I would need to check that and maybe come back to you on this after this webinar. There is another question also about genotoxic substances. When I explained the tiered approach that the Commission is contemplating for the assessment of substances in food contact materials, I explained that tier 1 substances was including endocrine disruptors, CMRs, and the question is, I have not seen the genotoxic substances in tier 1 substances, while there is a strong focus on genotoxic substances from the European Commission, and the attendee is asking us to comment. And obviously, again, you have to remember that what we have explained today are ideas of what the Commission is considering at this time. Nothing is really decided yet. So you should not really take any statement as a final statement. It is possible in this case that the Commission might include genotoxic substances in tier 1 group, because indeed, following especially the 15th, the adoption of the 15th amendment to the plastics regulation, there is a clear focus on substances that may be genotoxic, or at least for which the genotoxicity cannot be ruled out. So it is possible that in the future the Commission decides to include them in tier 1 substances, but it is not, we cannot really say that for sure, because again, the discussions are still ongoing. So there is also another question, and maybe Aleš, you could take over afterwards. There is a question regarding, so asking our opinion regarding the shift from substances to evaluation of substances to final materials. Will it increase responsibility for the end user of packaging, like the food manufacturer, or would it rather remain in the manufacture of the final material packaging? Well, it's hard to tell at this time because we have no clear view exactly of what the Commission is going to do, but the fact that the Commission is emphasizing its roadmap, the need to focus on the final article, seem to indicate, in my view, that indeed there is going to be an increased responsibility, which is a responsibility that exists already today, but it's going to be probably made clearer in the future that the final article is going to go under a closer scrutiny than today, because again, today, the main focus is on the starting substances that are being used. For instance, in plastics, they are subject to positive listings, subject to certain SML. There is the overall migration limit also that is set in the plastic regulation to control the overall migration of the food contact components. But at the end of the day, it seems that the Commission wants to shift a little bit its current assessment, or at least current approach, to put more focus on the final article, which might lead indeed to an increased responsibility, I would say, for the final article manufacturer. But again, everything is under discussion, so nothing is really final, basically.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Rashida. So yeah, many questions have been asked. Some of I think some of the questions have been addressed already later in the presentation. So maybe I will just go through Few of them. So for polymer registration, do we anticipate a replacement of the current requirement for monomer registration? This is actually a good question. Well, no, in principle, because it's not. Some monomers still need to be registered for polymers that will not be subject to registration. So I think it will. I think the monomer registration will not be abandoned. So indeed, in principle, there will be a double registration obligation to register monomers and also the polymer. This is a good point to be addressed with the authorities in the future. Maybe there will be some room for discussion here. At what level would an endocrine disruptor have to be classified and labeled? 0.1 or lower? I think this is likely to be lower and maybe even without any threshold, because I think endocrine disruptors are one of the substances that the authorities consider as being of no threshold. So it will definitely not be 0.1. I think it will be lower. Is the client Earth criteria? In the client Earth criteria, is performance not specifically mentioned? Yeah, so performance. I think performance is really not criterion for essential uses, unless we are talking about environmental performance, for example, or performance that has public health relevance, such as medical devices, for example. But the fact that the product functions better with substance of concern, provides better performance from the luxury or leisure perspective, is not going to be an argument. Are the presence of a substance as impurity excluded from the restriction related to non-essential uses? Well, yes, normally also substance as impurity is excluded from is covered by restrictions. Of course, if it's below the threshold that will be specified, then it will be excluded. And actually, the thresholds in restrictions are actually in general intended for impurities. They are not intended to allow intentional use. They are really just intended for impurities. You highlight the client Earth proposal. Do you believe this proposal has more chances than others to become part of the final essential use? I think we use the client Earth proposal because we think that this is the way in which the Commission is going to move. So that's why we included it there. Client Earth, of course, does not have any very prominent role. The Commission is not bound at all to implement what the Client Earth want, but we just think that what they outlined is reasonable and it's in the same way as the Commission is thinking. Yes, the question about other countries, whether the Commission is now aligning with other countries, I think not at the moment actively, but as I said, we have seen this in the past already. Whatever the Commission or the EU institutions comes up with may be carried over by other jurisdictions as well. What is meant by sustainable by design substances? So, okay, this is again one of the elements of the strategy that I was not talking extensively today. So, one of the elements is to have criteria for sustainable by design substances, and I think this is related to not to restriction of substances, but to their promotion. Basically, the Commission wants to define substances that are sustainable in order for them to be promoted. either by regulatory tools or financially, for example. This is my understanding of this concept. I think for us, the most relevant parts are the restrictions and bans that are planned, rather than this. Is a chemical strategy for sustainability also applying to food? Well, the sustainability of food chain is another element of the Green Deal. So sustainability of food chain is addressed specifically. REACH, CLP do not apply to food. So I would say I would say food is a bit separate from the chemical strategy. Yeah.
There is a comment also from somebody who is saying that the fact that in the discussion there would be a focus and basically a shift from hazard to hazard assessment, which would be basically the critical assessment for food contact notably. But I do agree with one of the comments that is mentioned that we received, where there would be a possibility still after the hazard is being identified for risk assessment to be done. But again, it is not clear at this time whether such risk assessment would be done taking into consideration dietary exposure, so that you could conclude that the substance is still safe for the intended use because the exposure to the dietary exposure is very low. That is certainly a rationale that we would like to see, but we are not sure that this is what is going to happen.
Maybe time for two more questions. So our opinion regarding the shift from substances to final materials, will this increase responsibility of the end user, or would it rather remain with the manufacturer of the packaging, for example?
I answered this question already.
Yeah. Okay, sorry, I didn't listen. But yeah, it's we see it with the SCIP database that really now every producer of articles have to know what their product contains, and it's sometimes very difficult to get it, but it's crucial. Will there be a difference between the use of substance versus the use of an article produced with a substance of concern? Normally not. Normally not, unless again there is a threshold always in restrictions in final articles. But as I said, this will only this will likely only tackle the use or the presence as impurities. But what will be, of course, different is that the essentiality can only be claimed with respect to the final article, to the final use. So for the manufacturers of substances actually who do not know where their substance will end, in which application, it may not affect them directly. Okay, so I think we exceeded the limits for 15 minutes. I hope that this webinar was useful. Please feel free to contact us. We will be happy to address any question that we did not address.
Yes, thank you very much, Aleš, for this presentation. Thank you all. For all the questions. There were a lot of questions that we were not able to address, but as Aleš was mentioning, please feel free to contact us, call us. That probably would be the easiest way to get an answer within a short time frame. So you take care all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.